Middle Way Philosophy, Introductory Video 3C, Suppression and Repression, Provisionality in Action, by Robert M. Ellis. This is a tributary video to video number 3 on provisionality. We saw in that video that provisionality, the ability to adapt our beliefs to new circumstances, involves both the awareness of limitations and the ability to consider alternatives. The awareness of limitations leads us to develop critical awareness. Considering alternatives requires optionality, that is, having other options, other possibilities that we can think about as alternatives. That may sound all well and good in theory, but how can it be compatible with practice? How can we possibly remain provisional whilst busily doing things, doing one thing and another thing, instead of thinking about the different options? When we're doing one particular activity, we're caught in the synaptic track for that particular action, a habitual way of doing things that we got used to. Surely we can't do that at the same time as thinking about alternatives. To see how provisionality could be compatible with action, let's think about our judgments as like a series of open containers. It seems that those containers, which represent different judgments, go before us into the future in a possibly infinite series. However, the judgment we're involved in at the moment is an open container. We can put things in it and we can take things out of it freely, so we can change the content of that judgment. It's not been finalized yet. It's still a provisional, open judgment. However, as we make those judgments going forward through time, it's as though we put lids on the containers. So we've closed up the judgments. We can't put anything in or take anything out of that judgment any longer. It's passed. So we go on to the next judgment. And making that judgment too, it becomes closed. And so for the next one and the next one. But there'll always be future judgments which are still open. Now imagine a judgment that in theory is still open, but the only option we actually consider is a closed past judgment. So we're considering this new judgment now only in terms of what's already happened in the past. That's what we could call a repressed judgment. Repression is absolutization. It's the unconditional use of power. Somebody who's subject to repression, whether internally or externally, has no options. They've lost their freedom. There's nothing else they can do. They have no creativity. The alternative, however, is to consider a wider range of options, not just what has already been closed in the past, but also other alternative options. Even if these are possibly difficult or embarrassing options, perhaps ones that we wouldn't very seriously consider, but we're still aware of them. In the end, though, of course, to make our judgment, we've got to rule out the remainder of those options. We've got to take one of them. We've got to close the lid. If we do that, though, with awareness of alternatives, that process only involves suppression, not repression. Suppression is also a helpful response when we're confronted with an inappropriate emotion, such as anger. With something like anger, it's not the emotionality that's the problem. It's the absolutization, or the absoluteness, of the options that anger confronts us with. We're so possessed by the anger that we do not think of alternatives. The state of our judgment in the state of anger is thus repressive. There's only one option available to us. That's one dominated by anger, by the obsession with removing the obstruction, whatever that is. If we were to repress anger, we would simply put something else in its place, which is just as repressive. However, it's more appropriate to suppress anger, which would mean putting it in quarantine so that it's harmless, but remaining aware of it. It's still within the field of what we consider, but there are now other options available to us. We can think about more appropriate ways of dealing with the obstacle to our wishes that created the anger, ways that might actually be much more effective in the long run. Suppression and repression also form an important part of the process of integration, which is described in the video with that title in this series. In that video, we talk about the story of the two mules as an example of integration. You can also see suppression and repression in the story of the two mules. So while the mules are in conflict with each other, they are each repressing any alternatives to the obsession that they have with eating from the heap of straw or whatever it is that they themselves are heading towards. At that point, they're repressing our alternatives and they're getting carried away by anger or obsession. They then need to suppress that anger or obsession, and they need to come together in order to consider other options. So it's that point where they're able to suppress the absolutization and consider other options that they begin to find an integrative solution. At that point, the repression, which has previously dominated their awareness, has concluded. They're in a more open state, they're able to make more effective, more adequate judgments. They can then, of course, share the process of eating the different piles of hay. Judgments based on repression are caught in a positive feedback loop, whereby our theories or beliefs give rise to practices that are merely expressive of those theories, which create confirmations which feed back into the theory. At no point is any new information or any doubt introduced into the circuit. So repression involves no other options being considered, an endless potential loop of inadequacy which may not consider conditions which lie outside that loop, which may be very important conditions. The process of suppression, on the other hand, can be part of a negative feedback loop, which is much more creative, which is much more likely to address conditions. So the theories or beliefs that we have are more flexible. Of course, yes, they have to be hardened, they have to be solidified at the point where we practice them. That's an inevitable part of being an organism. You know, whenever we act as though something was the case, as though there was a state of affairs that we knew about. But when those practices don't succeed in gaining the ends that they envisaged, in other words, when there's a falsification of what we intended, at that point we adjust our theory. So our beliefs become flexible. New options are introduced, in other words. So even though suppression is necessary in order to practice, in order to act, nevertheless, if we employ suppression, which allows new options to emerge when a falsification occurs, then we are able to adjust our beliefs when necessary. So, to summarise, the practice of provisionality involves maximising our options when we make judgments. But action shuts off those options. We have to choose. We have to act as though the world is a certain way when we act. There are two different ways in which we can remain aware or not when we act, however. If we repress, if our judgment is repressive, then we are limited to one option and we shut off other options. Repression creates positive feedback loops which prevent us discovering anything new, which lead us in the same inadequate, repetitive patterns. Suppression, on the other hand, is the temporary suspension of options for action, but they can be reconsidered later. So they return to us, awareness of alternatives comes back. Suppression is also necessary to prevent absolutizing options restricting our judgment, whether you see those absolutizing options as dogmas of belief or whether you see them as overwhelming emotions. The two are closely related to each other. Suppression is compatible with more adequate negative feedback loops, which allow our adaptation to new conditions.